Ralph Rourke had 12 reasons carved into the marrow of his bones, 12 reasons he would never marry again. And he had recited them to himself every single morning for 3 years, the way a preacher recites scripture, until the day Mae Kendrick rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a borrowed mule with a broken saddle strap and a carpetbag full of botanical drawings, and turned every last one of those reasons to dust without ever knowing a single one of them existed. The year was 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning against a fence post, watching the world pass by and pretending it wasn't interested. The cattle drive still came through in summer, thick with dust and noise, and the particular brand of trouble that follows men who have been too long on the open range. The town itself was neither elegant nor entirely lawless, sitting somewhere in between, with a sheriff who did his best, a church that was perpetually under some form of construction, a general store run by a man named Holt, a saloon called the Copper Kettle, and a doctor who doubled as the town's dentist and occasionally its veterinarian when circumstances demanded it. Ralph Rourke ran the livery stable at the south end of town. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that bore the history of hard work in every callus and scar. His hair was the dark brown of river water in autumn, and his eyes were a gray-green that shifted depending on the light and his mood. He was not a man given to unnecessary speech, but when he spoke, people listened, because he only ever said what he meant, and he meant everything he said. Children liked him because he never talked down to them. Dogs followed him because they had good instincts. Women noticed him and then wisely kept their distance, because word had gotten around that Ralph Rourke was not a man who was going to be caught again. His wife Clara had died 3 years prior. Fever, fast and merciless, the way fever worked in those days before there was much to be done about it. They had been married 5 years. She had been 27. He had been 31. They had a daughter together, a girl named Lucy who was now 6 years old and had her mother's stubborn dark eyes and her father's quiet intensity, and who had recently taken to collecting interesting rocks and storing them in her father's good hat. Ralph had loved Clara with the particular devotion of a steady man, and her death had not merely broken him, it had reorganized him. Where once he had been quietly open, now he was quietly closed. Where once there had been the possibility of softness in his expression, now there was only a careful, controlled stillness. He was not cold. He was not cruel. He was simply fortified, the way a man fortifies a building after the last storm proved what damage wind could do. And the 12 reasons lived in him like nails driven into timber. The first reason was this: he had already loved someone with everything he had, and that was a thing a man could only afford to do once. The second reason was that Lucy needed stability, not a parade of women who might leave or be left. The third reason was that any woman worth marrying deserved a man who could give her his whole heart, and his whole heart had already been given and then broken, and now it existed in pieces he wasn't sure could be properly reassembled. The fourth reason was practical. The livery barely made enough to support 2 people, let alone 3 or 4. The fifth reason was that he had already proven he wasn't good at the domestic arts of a marriage. The staying home, the conversation at the supper table, the making a woman feel she was chosen every day, and Clara had deserved more of that choosing than he had given her. The sixth reason was that the frontier was too hard a life for a woman who hadn't been born into it, and to bring someone new into it felt like cruelty. The seventh reason was that Lucy had begun, slowly, to feel settled and safe, and he would not disrupt that for the sake of his own loneliness. The eighth reason was that he had no patience left for the careful navigation of another human heart, the learning of preferences and fears, and the particular geography of another soul. The ninth reason was that 3 years of solitude had made him strange in the specific way that solitary men become strange. He talked to the horses more than to people. He ate meals in a particular order that had become ritual, and he was not sure he could be anything other than strange anymore. The 10th reason was that he was afraid. He knew this one with perfect clarity and hated it equally. The 11th reason was that every woman who had shown any interest in him since Clara's death reminded him of Clara in some way, and the comparison was unbearable and unfair to everyone involved. And the 12th reason, the one he kept at the very back of the list, the one he rarely looked at directly, was that loving someone and then watching them die was a particular kind of violence that no sane man would willingly invite upon himself again. 12 reasons. He said them every morning while he fed the horses at first light, and they kept him safe. Right up until the morning of October the 3rd, 1878, when a borrowed mule named Henry arrived at his livery fence with a broken saddle strap, and the woman holding Henry's bridle looked up at Ralph Rourke with the most direct brown eyes he had ever seen and said, "I don't know what your rates are, but I've only got 40 cents and a good disposition, and I'm hoping that one or both of those things might count for something." Mae Kendrick was 28 years old, originally from Missouri, recently from nowhere in particular. She was not what anyone would have called classically beautiful in the way the ladies' magazines described beauty, but she had a quality that was harder to name and considerably more powerful. She had a face that was entirely, honestly itself. No performance, no careful arrangement. Her dark hair was coming loose from its pins after what had clearly been a long and difficult journey, and she had a smear of something that looked like mud along her left jawline. And she was looking at him with the calm expectation of a woman who had learned to deal with whatever she was presented with, and fully intended to go on doing so. Ralph stared at her for exactly 2 seconds longer than was necessary, then looked at the mule. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Wichita, originally today. Before that, a farm outside of Wellington that turned out not to be the opportunity it was described as in the advertisement." She said this without particular bitterness, just the matter-of-fact reporting of events. "You answer an advertisement. Housekeeper position," she said. The advertisement was somewhat generous with the truth. He reached for the broken saddle strap and examined it without much ceremony. "This strap's been fraying for a while. You're lucky it held as long as it did." "Henry and I have an understanding," she said, and patted the mule's neck with a genuine affection that Ralph noted involuntarily. "You need the mule stabled. I need to know if there is a boarding house in this town that might take 40 cents as a partial payment on credit until I can find work." She looked at him steadily when she said it, not ashamed, not overly proud about it either. Just asking. Ralph looked back at her for a moment. There was something in the directness of it that he hadn't prepared a defense against, because it wasn't the kind of thing that required defense. It was simply a person in a practical situation asking a practical question. "Mrs. Alderman on Chestnut Street," he said. "Tell her Ralph sent you. She'll work something out." Mae Kendrick looked at him with a small, genuine smile that did something annoying to the general territory of Ralph's chest. "Thank you, Ralph," she said, as if they had already been acquainted for some time and his name was perfectly natural in her mouth. "Rourke," he said, which was not what he had intended to say. "Mae Kendrick," she said, extending her hand. He shook it. It was a firm handshake. He had not expected that either. She left Henry in his care. He told her the 40 cents would cover it, which was not strictly accurate but was what he said, and she walked up toward Chestnut Street with her carpetbag over one shoulder and the particular walk of a woman who was tired, but was not going to let that show any more than was unavoidable. Ralph stood in his livery and looked at Henry for a while. Henry looked back at him with the philosophical patience of a mule who had seen a great deal. "Don't," Ralph said to Henry. Henry flicked one ear. Ralph went and fed the other horses and tried very hard to think about absolutely nothing at all. He failed. Mae Kendrick found a room at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house and was given credit against future wages in the efficient and unsentimental way that Mrs. Alderman operated, which Mae appreciated enormously because it carried no pity in it. By the second morning she was in Caldwell. She had already introduced herself to Holt at the general store, learned that the schoolteacher position she had heard rumor of on the trail was indeed available, and had gone to speak with the town council's representative, a man named Deacon Ferris, about her qualifications. She had completed 2 years of teacher's college in Missouri before family circumstances, specifically the death of both parents in a single winter, influenza taking them both within a week of each other, had interrupted her education. But she had continued reading everything she could find. She had a tidy, confident hand. She was competent in mathematics, history, and literature. And she spoke with a clarity and precision that apparently impressed Deacon Ferris enough that he offered her the position on a trial basis of 6 weeks before she even finished explaining her qualifications. She accepted with the same calm efficiency with which she accepted everything, and walked back to Mrs. Alderman's boarding house feeling, for the first time in a long time, like she might actually be landing somewhere that would hold. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town, recently whitewashed on the outside and rather earnestly disorganized on the inside. Me spent the better part of a day sorting through the existing materials, creating a rudimentary curriculum, writing out a schedule on the blackboard in her best hand, and arranging the desks in a configuration that she believed would encourage attention rather than the chaos she suspected had previously reigned. It was while she was carrying a stack of primers out of the supply room that she nearly walked directly into a small girl who was standing in the schoolroom doorway with a rock in each hand and a look of intense scientific concentration on her face. "Hello," me said, setting the primers down carefully. "Hello," the girl said. "I'm Lucy Rourke, I'm 6. I'm starting school on Monday. I wanted to see what it looked like first." Me looked at her with the kind of attention that children usually only receive from adults who genuinely like children, which is rarer than it should be. "That seems like a very sensible thing to do," me said. "I'm Miss Kendrick. I'm the new teacher. I also wanted to see what it looked like, which is why I'm here." Lucy held up the rocks. "Do you know what these are?" Me looked at them carefully, leaning closer. "That one looks like it might be a piece of limestone. And that one," she pointed to the rounder of the two, "I'm not certain, but the coloring makes me think it might be chert. Do you know what chert is?" Lucy's eyes went wide. "No," she said. "It's a kind of rock that was used to make tools a very long time ago," me said. "People would chip it into shapes. It's very hard." Lucy looked down at the rock with renewed reverence. "My papa says I collect too many rocks," she said. "I used to collect pressed flowers," me said. "I had a whole book of them. Some people think that's what collections are, for keeping things you find beautiful or interesting so you can keep thinking about them." Lucy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can I come back on Monday?" she asked. "That's exactly what Monday is for," me said. Lucy left, and me stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment with a quiet that felt different from the quiet she had been living in for the past year. It felt like the quiet before something rather than the quiet after. She did not think about Ralph Rourke specifically. She thought about Lucy Rourke and her rocks and her serious eyes, and how teaching that particular child was going to be one of the more interesting things she had done in a while. It was only later, considerably later, lying in the narrow bed at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house listening to the night sounds of Caldwell, that she thought about the man at the livery stable and the way he had looked at Henry's broken saddle strap with the focused attention of someone who took things seriously even when those things were small, and how he had told her about Mrs. Alderman without making her feel small for needing to ask. She thought about that for a minute or so, and then she thought about her lesson plan for Monday, and then she fell asleep. The school opened, and Mae Kendrick turned out to be exactly the kind of teacher that the children of Caldwell had not previously had. She was clear. She was patient. She was completely unimpressed by nonsense but deeply interested in genuine curiosity. And she had a way of asking questions that made thinking feel like an adventure rather than an obligation. By the end of the first week, the older children were staying late voluntarily to finish problems that had interested them. By the end of the second week, parents were stopping Deacon Ferris on the street to say positive things, which was unusual enough that he mentioned it to several people. Lucy Rourke was in Mae's class, of course, and Lucy Rourke was immediately one of the most interesting students in the room. She was quiet in the way her father was quiet, not withdrawn, but listening carefully before she spoke, and when she did speak, it was always worth attending to. She brought a different rock every single day for the first 2 weeks, placing it on the edge of Mae's desk before taking her seat, and Mae named them all without making it into a lesson, and without ever being bored by it. Ralph learned about this from Lucy herself. "Miss Kendrick knows what chairt is," Lucy reported at supper one evening with the tone of someone delivering significant news. "Does she?" Ralph said. "She knows all the rocks," Lucy said. "She had a book of pressed flowers, but she said she left it behind when she came here. She said some things get left behind, but the knowing what they are doesn't get left behind." Ralph looked at his daughter. "You talk to her a lot." "She talks back," Lucy said simply, as if this were the entirety of the explanation, which Ralph supposed it was. He thought about Mae Kendrick and her 40 cents and her direct eyes and her apparently encyclopedic knowledge of geological formations, and he told himself all 12 reasons in their correct order, and then he ate his supper and did not think about her. He failed at this particular project roughly 4 times a week for the next month. The reason he finally spoke to her again, outside of simple civic necessity, was the incident with the Calhoun brothers' horses. The Calhoun brothers, Ned and Pete, were a pair of cattlemen from down south who came through Caldwell twice a year on their way up the trail and twice more on their way back, and who were not bad men exactly, but were men who had never been taught to be particularly careful with things that weren't their own. They kept 4 horses and they kept them hard, and when they brought the horses to Ralph's livery in early November, Ralph saw immediately that one of the 4, a bay mare named by some previous optimist Dolly, had a leg that needed attention. He told the Calhoun brothers this. They told him it was fine, she was a tough animal, and they'd be back in 2 days. Ralph looked at Dolly for a long time after they left. He was not the kind of man who acted outside of his own business without very good reason. He was also not the kind of man who watched an animal suffer without cause. He began attending to the leg, knowing full well the Calhoun brothers would have objections. It was while he was in the middle of this project, on the afternoon of a Saturday when school was not in session, that Mae Kendrick appeared at the livery door with a basket over one arm and a look of focused purpose. "I have an apple, some oats, and a poultice I made last night," she said, "if you'll let me help." He stared at her. "How did you know about the horse, Mrs.?" "Alderman's back window looks over here," she said calmly. "I saw you working yesterday, and the way you were angled, I recognized what the trouble was. My father kept horses. I know a decent poultice recipe." Ralph straightened up and looked at her. She was standing in the doorway of his livery with a basket of horse medicine she had prepared the previous evening for an animal she did not own, belonging to men who would not thank her, with no expectation of anything at all, as far as he could tell. The third reason he would never marry again tried to assert itself. He pushed it aside with some difficulty. "Come in, then," he said. She came in and went directly to Dolly with the particular confidence of someone who knew horses, and knew that confidence was what horses needed. She spoke to the mare in a low, even voice while she examined the leg, and Dolly, who had been skittish with Ralph when he first started working on her, stood with the steady patience of an animal that has been correctly read. "Your poultice is better than mine," Ralph admitted after watching her apply it. "It's a recipe from a veterinary manual I found in my father's things," she said. "I've always thought horse medicine was an underappreciated art. Most people don't carry veterinary manuals in their carpet bag," he said. "I carry 4 books," she said. "The veterinary manual, a botany text, a volume of history, and a novel I've read 3 times but keep anyway. I don't think that's an unusual number." "It's an unusual selection," he said. "I'm an unusual person," she said, without particular pride or apology, just as a statement of observable fact. He found himself almost smiling. He tightened his mouth against it. They worked on Dolly together for an hour, and then Ralph noticed that the light was going and Mae was still there, and he had not once in that entire hour thought about any of the 12 reasons, which alarmed him considerably. "I'll walk you back to Mrs. Alderman's," he said. "It's getting dark." She looked at him with a slight tilting of her head, as if she was assessing whether this was a courtesy or something else. "That's kind," she said. "Thank you." They walked up the main street of Caldwell in the November evening, which had the particular cold clarity of a Great Plains autumn, the sky going deep blue-black at the edges and the stars coming up sharp and hard. Mae walked beside him with the easy stride of someone comfortable in open spaces, and for 3 blocks they said very little, and it was not uncomfortable at all, which was itself uncomfortable in a way Ralph couldn't quite name. "Lucy told me about her mother," Mae said, when they were almost at Chestnut Street. Ralph did not tense outwardly. He had practiced not tensing at that subject. "Did she?" he said. "She said her mother used to sing to the horses," Mae said. "She said you still do sometimes when you think no one is listening." He said nothing for a moment. "Lucy has good ears," he said finally. "She has good eyes too," Mae said. "She notices a great deal about people she cares about." He opened his mouth to say something that might have been either a deflection or an acknowledgement, but they had arrived at Mrs. Alderman's gate, and Mae stopped and turned to face him with those direct brown eyes. "Thank you for the walk," she said, "and for letting me help with Dolly." "Dolly's better for it," he said. "So am I," Mae said, which was just a simple statement about enjoying useful work, Ralph told himself, and it absolutely was not the kind of thing that should cause him any difficulty whatsoever. He walked back to the livery in the cold dark and stood with the horses for a while, going through the 12 reasons methodically, one after another, and by the time he got to reason 4, the practical one about money, he realized he was going through the motions of a ritual that was losing its power, and that frightened him in the specific way of a man who has constructed careful walls and begins to hear them creak. The Calhoun brothers came back 2 days later and were indeed displeased about the work Ralph had done on Dolly without their explicit request. Pete Calhoun was the louder of the two, and he expressed his displeasure in a way that involved volume and profanity in roughly equal measure. Ralph stood and listened to it with the unhurried patience of a man who was confident in what he had done and was prepared to defend it without escalation. "The horse would have gone lame," Ralph said. "You'd have lost her before spring. I don't apologize for the work, but I'll tell you exactly what I used and why." Ned Calhoun, the quieter of the two, looked at Dolly and then at his brother and then at Ralph. "How much do we owe you?" he asked. "Usual rate for the boarding plus what the poultice materials cost me," Ralph said, which wasn't much. Pete was still aggrieved, but Ned settled the bill with a look that said the matter was closed, and they took the horses and left, and Dolly walked out of the livery with a stride that was noticeably better than when she'd come in. Mae had watched the whole thing from the side of the street where she happened to be passing with a stack of school books, and she watched Pete Calhoun's retreating back with a look of assessment that Ralph caught from 30 yards away. "You handled that well," she called across. "I've handled it before," he said. She smiled at that, just briefly, and continued on her way to the schoolhouse, and Ralph went back to work and had a very long argument with reason number 6. That the frontier was too hard a life for a woman who hadn't been born into it, because Mae Kendrick quite obviously had been born into it, or at least had arrived at it through enough difficulty that she was entirely at home in its requirements. November deepened and the Kisham Trail quieted for winter, which meant Caldwell settled into its off-season character: fewer strangers, fewer cattle, fewer incidents at the Copper Kettle, more of the quiet, ordinary business of people who lived somewhere and were committed to the project of continuing to do so. Mae established herself in the rhythms of the town with the efficiency of a woman who had done this before, found herself welcomed at the church sewing circle, not because she was particularly devoted to sewing, but because it was where information traveled, and she had learned early that a person who understands the information architecture of a community can navigate it far more effectively. She was honest about her situation, a woman alone, making her own living, which was not unusual in 1878 in the way it might have seemed from a distance, because the frontier had produced a particular strain of self-sufficient women that the rest of the country hadn't quite caught up to understanding yet. She became friendly with a woman named Della Morris, who was the wife of the town's blacksmith, and who had the specific brand of cheerful practicality that me found deeply refreshing. Della knew everything about everyone in Caldwell and communicated all of it freely and without malice, which was a combination that me found both useful and genuinely likable. "Ralph Rourke," Della said one Wednesday at the sewing circle, looking at me with the directness of a woman who has decided to address a subject, "is a good man who has convinced himself he is content." Me looked up from her work. "I don't know him well," she said. "You don't need to know someone well to see them," Della said. "You see him, I've watched you." "He was kind when I arrived," me said carefully. "He's kind to everyone," Della said. "He's kind to horses. He's kind to Lucy. He's been kind to this whole town for 3 years without asking for one single thing in return, and there's a limit to how long that is sustainable as a way of living." Me was quiet for a moment. "He lost his wife," she said. "He did," Della said. "And he's been carrying that like a man carries a stone, not to somewhere useful, just carrying it because putting it down feels like forgetting her." She looked at me. "I'm not suggesting anything, mind you. I'm just describing the landscape." Me went home and thought about the landscape, and about a man who sang to horses when he thought no one was listening, and about a little girl who brought her teacher rocks every morning and whose eyes were the color of the river at the end of summer. She was not in love. She was interested. She was careful about the difference. December arrived with genuine cold, and with it came the particular intimacy that winter imposes on small communities. Everyone indoors more gathering, more of the particular warmth of shared interior spaces against the dark and the cold outside. The church finally completed enough of its construction to hold a proper service, and the Christmas service was planned with the kind of collective enthusiasm that only comes from having worked hard towards something. Me was asked to help organize the children's portion of the service, which seemed natural given her role, and she accepted. It was in the course of this organizational process that she encountered Ralph Rourke with some frequency, because Lucy had been designated to read a passage, and Ralph had opinions about which passage, and those opinions required conversation with Miss Kendrick, which Ralph appeared to find simultaneously necessary and faintly uncomfortable, in a way that me was beginning to find charming despite her best efforts. He came to the schoolhouse one afternoon to discuss the matter of the passage, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolroom with his hat in his hands in a way that made him look considerably less armored than his usual presentation. "Lucy wants to do the one about the star," he said. "She told me," me said. "She's been practicing. I heard her this morning," he said. "Through the wall she was up before dawn with a candle." Me looked at him and could not quite contain her smile. "She's going to be wonderful," she said. "She has a very clear way of reading. She doesn't perform it, she just says it, and that's much better." He looked slightly surprised. "That's exactly what Clara," he stopped. The room held the sentences ending like a breath held. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," me said with perfect gentleness. "She sounds like she was a wonderful person." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window, at the frost patterns forming on the lower pane, and me could see him deciding whether to speak or not, and she waited without pressure, without filling the silence with her own noise. "She was," he said finally. "She was exactly herself always, no pretending." Me recognized this particular quality, the value of it, the rarity of it, because it was the thing she had always tried to be herself, and it was the thing she most respected in others. "Lucy has that," me said. "She brought me a piece of granite last Tuesday and told me it looked like it was thinking. She was right." He looked at her then, and something shifted in his expression, not opened exactly, but shifted, like a door that moves slightly in a frame without actually swinging wide. "She talks about you," he said, "more than she's talked about much lately." "She's a remarkable child," Mae said simply. He put his hat back on with the deliberate motion of a man who is reassembling himself. "The star passage is fine," he said, "for the service." "It's a perfect choice," Mae said. He nodded once, thanked her in a voice that was carefully normal, and left. And Mae turned back to her lesson preparation, and spent approximately 15 minutes being thoroughly unable to concentrate on anything other than the specific quality of the silence he had broken, and then restored, and what it was that lived inside it. The Christmas service was held on the evening of December the 24th, with the completed church packed full of the entire population of Caldwell and a number of surrounding homesteaders who had made the journey in the cold, because there are occasions that require presence, and this was one of them. Candles made the church gold and warm against the black December outside, and the smell of pine boughs that misses. Aldermen had contributed filled the space with something that felt ancient and necessary. Lucy Rourke stood at the front of the church in a dress that was clearly her best, her dark hair braided precisely, her father's careful hand visible in the preparation of her appearance. She held the Bible with both hands. She looked out at the congregation with those serious eyes, and she read the passage about the star in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely, honestly itself. Mae, sitting in the third row, felt something move in her chest that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with what she was watching, which was a child who had been well loved and was becoming, in the specific architecture of her small self, someone remarkable. She did not look at Ralph Rourke during his daughter's reading. She didn't need to. She knew, the way you know things that aren't logic, that he was somewhere in the room behind her, feeling something that was too big for his chest, and too much for his 12 reasons, and too real to keep carrying alone much longer. After the service, in the cold outside the church, people stood around with their breath making clouds in the air, and children ran between the adults' legs in the aftermath of having been very still for a long time. Mae was speaking with Della when she felt someone at her shoulder and turned to find Ralph Rourke standing slightly closer than he usually placed himself, with Lucy's small hand in his large one. "She did well," Mae said. "She did," he said. "Miss Kendrick," Lucy said, tugging her father's sleeve, "Papa has an apple cake at home that I made with him. Would you like to come?" Mae watched Ralph Rourke's expression move through at least 3 distinct phases in approximately 1 second: surprise at his daughter's invitation, the instinct toward refusal, and then something else, something underneath the refusal that was stronger and older and more honest than the refusal was. "You don't have to," he said. "I'd like to," Mae said. So they walked together through the cold Christmas Eve of Caldwell, the 3 of them, Lucy between them, holding both their hands by the time they reached the end of the church path, which she had accomplished with the pragmatic efficiency of a child who sees what she wants and acts on it. And Ralph had not stopped her, and Mae had not stopped her, and neither of them pointed out to each other what it looked like, which was a family walking home. The house attached to the livery stable was small and entirely honest, a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, everything kept with the undecorated tidiness of a man who maintained things from habit, and because order in a small space meant order in a life. Mae noticed the small things: a pair of Lucy's shoes by the door, lined up neatly, a book on the mantelpiece that was clearly well read, a drawing on the wall that was Lucy's work, a horse with very sincere eyes, framed in a piece of wood that Ralph had clearly made himself. The apple cake was genuinely excellent, and Lucy was very pleased about this, and explained every step of its preparation in considerable detail. Ralph made coffee on the fire, and they sat at the kitchen table in the warmth of the small house, while outside the temperature dropped and the stars went cold and sharp, and Mae Kendrick felt something she had not felt in a long time: the deep specific ease of being exactly where you are and not wishing for anywhere else. They talked. Not about nothing, They talked about real things. Mee talked about her parents in Missouri and the teacher's college she hadn't been able to finish. Ralph talked about the horses and the trail seasons and the way Caldwell changed between summer and winter, like two different towns occupying the same space. Lucy fell asleep against Mee's arm at the table, which happened gradually and naturally, and Ralph looked at his daughter and then at Mee with an expression that had in it something very close to naked honesty. "She doesn't do that," he said quietly. "Fall asleep on people. She's comfortable," Mee said. "She trusts easily," he said, "like her mother did." He said it this time without stopping himself. He said it and sat with it, and Mee let him, neither rushing to fill it nor treating it as something that required careful management. "That's a beautiful thing to carry forward," Mee said. "Her mother's trust." He looked at her across the table in the firelight. He was 34 years old and careful and quiet and built of hard work and love and grief and 12 reasons. And he was looking at her with the eyes of a man who is watching the walls he built prove permeable, one small incremental molecule at a time, and who is terrified and grateful in equal measure. "She trusts you," he said. "Lucy." "I know," Mee said. "I'm honored by it." He carried Lucy to her bed, because she had drifted all the way under into deep sleep. And Mee stood in the main room and looked at the drawing on the wall and the worn book on the mantel, and the general evidence of a life being lived carefully and quietly, and in dedication to love even when love was painful. And she felt, with a clarity that was new and certain, that she understood this man in the way that you understand some people without needing the full translation. He came back from Lucy's room and stood in the doorway to the main room, and she turned and they looked at each other across the small, warm space. "I should go," she said. "It's late." "I'll walk you," he said. He walked her back to Mrs. Alderman's, and they walked slowly, because neither of them was in a particular hurry, and the cold was the kind of cold that makes people walk close, and they walked close, their shoulders almost touching. "Me," he said when they reached the gate. She turned. She did not say anything. She waited. "I don't know how to," he started and then stopped. He was not a man given to incomplete sentences. The incompleteness of this one said more than the sentence itself could have. "Neither do I," she said, with complete honesty. "But I think we can both stand here and not know how, and that can be all right for now." He looked at her for a long moment in the Christmas Eve cold. "Yes," he said, "it can." She went in. He walked back, and the 12 reasons in his chest had by that point begun to operate less like nails in timber and more like nails that had been in the rain for a season, still there, still visible, but the timber around them had changed. January was hard, the way January in Kansas is always hard, deep and cold and long. But there is a particular way that hard winters make people present to each other, because the cold outside makes the warm inside more vivid, and the warmth you share with another person more significant. Ralph started stopping by the schoolhouse on his way back from the afternoon feed, because Lucy often stayed late to help me organize the materials for the next day, and it was natural and practical to collect her, and it was also a reason that both he and me appeared willing to accept on its face without examination. What happened inside the schoolhouse during those stops was ordinary in the specific way that only becomes extraordinary in retrospect. Mee would be at the blackboard erasing the day's work, or at her desk marking the students' exercises, and Lucy would be reorganizing the rock collection she had begun keeping in a wooden box in the corner, and Ralph would stand in the doorway for a moment and then come in, and they would talk about the small things of the day, and the small things accumulated. The first time she made him laugh, really laugh, not just a brief lift at the corner of his mouth, was in the 3rd week of January, when she told him about the incident that morning in which Tommy Holt, age 8, had argued with considerable passion that the Missouri River flowed backward compared to rivers in general, and had produced a hand-drawn map as evidence, and that the map was so genuinely original in its geography that she had kept it. Ralph's laugh was not what she expected. She had expected something careful, measured. What she got was genuine. It broke through his usual stillness, and it was warm and it changed his face entirely. And Mae looked at him laughing in the doorway of her schoolroom on a cold January afternoon, and the last of her careful management of her own feelings became rather theoretical. The eighth reason, the one about not having patience for the learning of another person's geography, was doing particularly poorly by this point, because Ralph had noticed, entirely against his intentions, that Mae Kendrick took her coffee with no sugar, that she had a habit of pressing her fingers against her lips when she was thinking hard, that she kept the botany book at the desk because she sometimes opened it between tasks and looked at illustrations with the concentrated pleasure of someone visiting a place they love, and that she was braver about difficult things than almost anyone he had ever known and didn't seem to be particularly aware of it as bravery. She simply treated difficulty as a problem to be worked through, and she worked through it. These things had accumulated in him without his permission, and by February they were a weight of knowing that had its own shape and its own gravity, and he was finding that gravity increasingly difficult to navigate around. It was Della Morris who brought matters to a point. Della was not a meddling woman, but she was a perceptive one, and she had been watching Ralph Rourke and Mae Kendrick do the very careful dance of two people who are falling in love, and have decided that the proper response to this is to pretend it isn't happening, and she had a limited tolerance for this particular form of waste. She did not arrange anything dramatic. She simply, during a gathering at the church hall for a February community supper, contrived to seat them next to each other, and then she contrived to ensure that every other seat around them was occupied by people with whom she urgently needed to speak, leaving me and Ralph in a pocket of relative privacy in the midst of community noise, which was both more intimate and more comfortable than formal isolation would have been. And in that pocket, in the noise and warmth of the community supper with the smell of cornbread and venison stew, and the sound of children running between the tables, something happened that had been building since October. "I've been thinking," Ralph said, which was not an usual opening for him, but the way he said it was different, there was a weight in it. "About," Mae said. He looked at his plate for a moment, then at her. "About whether I am a man who still knows how to be present to someone," he said, "in the way that matters." She understood this immediately and completely. She turned to face him slightly, in the way of someone who is attending with their whole self. "Why would you question that?" she said. "Because I've been absent," he said. "By choice. For 3 years I've been doing the things that needed doing and not being present to any of it in the full way." "You've been present to Lucy," she said. "Lucy I could not be present to," he said. "She won't allow it." A brief moment of something that was almost a smile. But beyond that, he stopped. He started again. "Mae, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask you because I mean it, not because I don't know what it would mean." She waited. "Would you allow me to court you," he said, "properly, if you have any interest in that at all? If not, I understand completely and nothing between us needs to change. I would not make it strange. I just—" He stopped again. He looked as if the sentence had gotten away from him. Mae looked at Ralph Rourke, 34 years old, steady and quiet and carefully armored and genuinely, deeply good, sitting next to her in the noise of a community supper with all his careful walls showing their cracks, and she felt something enormous and calm settle into her chest. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that very much." He breathed. It was a breath that had in it 3 years of held tension and the specific relief of a man who has asked for something he was afraid to need. "All right," he said. His voice was careful, and something underneath it was not careful at all. "All right." Della Morris, from 3 seats down, caught Mae's eye across the table and raised her coffee cup an inch in a toast that was small and private, and said everything. Courting in Caldwell in February of 1879 meant particular things. It meant Ralph began meeting me at the schoolhouse, not just to collect Lucy, but to walk with me to supper. It meant Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table with Lucy drawing while they talked. It meant slow walks along the creek on the rare days when the cold lifted. It meant the particular language of two careful people beginning to speak honestly. He told her about Clara on a Sunday afternoon in late February, with Lucy in the next room and the fire going low. He told her without performing grief or managing it. He told her the actual story, with the real texture of it. He told her about the 5 years of marriage and the good parts and the parts where he knew he had fallen short, the distance he sometimes kept by habit, the times he had been physically present and somewhere else in his head, and the fever that came in March 3 years ago and was gone in 11 days and took Clara with it. Me listened the way she listened to everything, with her whole attention, without rushing ahead, without offering consolation at the expense of truth. She sounds like someone who deserved to be known completely, me said, when he finished. She was, he said. She was better than I was at loving out loud. I think, me said, that you love out loud rather more than you know. You just do it quietly. He looked at her. She looked back. They were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table in the Sunday afternoon light, and the distance between them was small, and the silence between them was full of something warm and urgent and patient all at once. He reached across the table and took her hand. Just that. Her hand in his, on the table in the quiet house, with the fire going and Lucy in the next room and the Kansas winter outside. She turned her hand over and held his back. They stayed like that for a while, which was enough. The fifth reason, the one about not being good at the domestic arts of marriage, the staying home, the conversation, the choosing, had been effectively dismantled the moment he sat down opposite her in the schoolhouse on a cold January afternoon and talked about nothing in particular for 45 minutes and found it to be the best 45 minutes of his week. He was better at loving out loud than Clara had gotten to witness, and it had taken him 3 years of loneliness and one honest woman to understand that. March arrived, and with it, a particular test that Ralph had not anticipated. A man from Wichita arrived in Caldwell looking for a school teacher. His name was Horton, and he represented a newly established school in a neighborhood of Wichita that had come into some money and wanted qualified teachers. And Deacon Ferris, to his credit, told Horton that they had an excellent teacher and were not interested in losing her. But Horton was the kind of man who believed that a better offer was always compelling. He found me at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon and made his offer, which was nearly twice what Caldwell was paying her. He was polite and professional about it. He laid it out plainly. Me thanked him and said she needed a day to think about it. She sat in the empty schoolhouse after Horton left and looked at the rock collection in the corner wooden box, and the student drawings on the wall, and the particular slant of the afternoon light through the windows she had come to know over 5 months. And she thought about Wichita and twice the salary, and the question of what she owed herself against what she had built here. She walked to the livery before supper. Ralph was working on a horse's shoe, and he straightened up when she came in and read her expression with the attention he gave everything. She told him about Horton and the offer. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw tightened slightly. He put down the tool he was holding. "That's a good offer," he said carefully. "It is," she said. "You should consider it properly," he said, and she could hear the effort in the evenness of his voice. "I am," she said. "That's why I'm here." He looked at her then. "I'm not asking you to make my decision for me," she said. "I want to tell you what I'm considering, and I want you to tell me honestly what you think." He was quiet for a longer moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower and more careful than usual. "I think," he said, "that you are the best thing that has happened to this town in a long time. I think Lucy would be devastated, which you already know. I think," he stopped. He started again with the particular courage of a man pushing through the armor. "I think if you go to Wichita, I will have made the mistake of waiting too long to say things that should have been said before they became reasons for you to stay or go." Me looked at him steadily. "Then say them now," she said, "while I'm here." He crossed the distance between them in the livery stable on a March afternoon in 1879, and he took her face in both his large scarred hands with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. And he looked at her for a moment with everything in his eyes, all of it, the grief and the fear and the 12 reasons, and the way they had been coming apart at the seams since October, and the particular terrifying, enormous fact of what he felt. And then he kissed her. It was not an uncertain kiss. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who has made up his mind after a very long and careful deliberation, and means every word. Mae kissed him back with equal honesty and equal conviction, and the horses in their stalls regarded this event with the mild philosophical attention of creatures who have seen a great deal of human emotion and have opinions about none of it. When they stepped back, she looked at him with her eyes bright, and her expression the most unguarded he had seen it. "I'm turning down the Wichita offer," she said. "Me. Not because of what just happened," she said firmly. "Because I thought it through, and this is where I want to be. This is my school and my students and my life. Wichita is more money, but I'm not going to Wichita." She looked at him with the directness that had undone him from the first morning. "I want you to know the decision was mine, and I made it clearly." He let out a breath that was half a laugh. "You are the most particular woman I have ever met," he said, which was entirely a compliment, and they both knew it. "I know," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "No, it is not." She rode back to Mrs. Alderman's and wrote a polite letter to Mr. Horton declining his offer. And she felt, as she sealed it, the specific clarity of a person who has chosen their life rather than fallen into it. April came with the particular explosion of the Kansas spring, everything greening at once, the air turning from knife cold to something soft and possible, the meadowlarks back in the grass beyond the town. The Kishom Trail was waking up, and the first cattle drives of the season were moving north, and Caldwell was filling again with its summer self. Ralph and Mae had fallen into something that was entirely itself and resisted easy description. They were courting with an honesty that made the word feel too small. They had arguments, real ones, not the theatrical kind. They argued about the best method of teaching long division, and about whether Caldwell's sheriff was handling a particular property dispute correctly, and about the best way to winterproof the livery's north wall. And the arguments ended with both of them having moved slightly, which is the sign of a real argument rather than a performance. He told her about reasons 1 through 12, not in a single confession but slowly, over the weeks of April, pieces of it, sometimes sideways. He told her about his fear of losing someone again on a night they sat on the porch in the spring warmth. He told her about Lucy's stability and his concerns about it on a Sunday afternoon. He told her about the third reason, the whole heart, already given, on an evening when she asked him to tell her something he had never told anyone. She did not dismantle the reasons. She never knew they existed as a list, as a deliberate system of defense. She simply was herself, consistently and completely, and the reasons came apart against her reality one by one in the only way that matters, not through argument or persuasion, but through the accumulated evidence of a living person contradicting the fears that had been constructed in her absence. "Do you know what I think?" she said on the evening he told her about the third reason, about the whole heart already given. "Tell me," he said. "I think a heart that has loved well has more capacity for it, not less," she said. "I think grief is the evidence of love and not the contradiction of it, and I think Clara would recognize, if she could see it, that what you have left for someone else is not a lesser amount but simply a different living of the same essential thing." He was quiet for a very long time. The spring dark was warm around them on the porch, and somewhere out in the grass the meadowlarks were singing their evening songs. "You're a remarkable woman," he said. "I'm just honest," she said. "That is what's remarkable about you," he said. In early May, on a Sunday morning when the prairie was the particular gold green of late spring, Ralph took me on a ride out east of town to a place he had found 3 years ago, shortly after Clara died, when he used to ride out alone in the early mornings before Lucy woke. It was a slight rise in the land with a view that went to the edge of seeing, the sky enormous overhead and the grass moving in waves, and he had not brought anyone there before. They sat on the rise together on a blanket and ate the sandwiches Mee had packed and drank coffee from a tin pot and watched the light move across the grass, and Ralph said nothing about why he had brought her here, and Mee did not ask, because she understood in the way she understood most things about him, directly, without translation. After a while he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "I don't have a ring yet. I've been thinking about that, and I want to be honest that I don't have it yet." "Ralph, I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because Lucy needs a mother, though she does, and she loves you and you love her, and that is a true and wonderful thing. Not because it's practical, though it is. Because I love you. Because you have been the most consistently honest presence in my life for the past 7 months, and I cannot imagine my life forward without you in it. And I don't want to. Because I am afraid," his voice went slightly rough here, "of loving someone and losing them, and I have decided that the fear is not a reason to refuse the love. It's just a true thing about a man who has loved before." Me looked at him on the rise above the spring prairie, with the grass moving and the sky going from blue to deeper blue toward the horizon. This steady, quiet, good man who had dismantled his own walls one careful brick at a time because she had been real enough that the walls had no purchase, and she felt in her chest the full weight of an answer she had known for a long time. "Yes," she said. "Ralph, yes." He took her hands. He held them the way you hold something you are grateful for. He looked at her with his gray-green eyes in the May morning light, and he smiled, fully, without reservation, without the careful management. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a face. They sat on the rise for another hour, talking about the future in the specific way that two people talk when they have one together, about the house and the school and Lucy and the shape of the days ahead. They talked about children carefully, both knowing it was a conversation that required honesty. He said he hoped, if she was willing, that their family might grow. She said she had always wanted children, and she said it simply, and he said good, in a voice that held the full measure of what that word contained. Lucy Rourke, when she was told that Sunday evening, sat very still for exactly 5 seconds in a way that made Ralph hold his breath, and then she got up from her chair, walked to me, put both her arms around me's waist and held on. Me held her back. Over Lucy's head she looked at Ralph, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. They were married in July of 1879, in the church that had finally, fully, completed its construction, which felt appropriate in the way that circumstances sometimes arrange themselves into meaning. The whole of Caldwell came, because Caldwell was a small town, and that is what small towns do, but also because both Ralph Rourke and Mae Kendrick had, in their different ways, given something real to the place and the people in it, and people show up for that. Della Morris cried with an efficiency and a cheerfulness that perfectly expressed her character. Mrs. Alderman wore her best hat, which she had not worn in 2 years, and stood in the front row with the satisfaction of a woman who had been a small but essential piece of a good outcome. Deacon Ferris performed the ceremony with a genuine warmth that surprised people who had found him stiff at the service level. Me wore a dress she and Della had made together from fabric ordered from Wichita, not white, which was impractical, but a deep cream that suited her coloring, with the kind of clean lines that suited her character. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Lucy had gathered that morning in the field east of town, and the bunch included, along with the wildflowers, 3 particularly interesting rocks that Lucy had included because they seemed appropriate for the occasion. Ralph stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, the suit he had worn to his first wedding and then put away and had now taken out again without the weight he had expected, because the weight had changed, because grief carried properly becomes something you can lay down, not something you pretend away. And he watched me walk up the aisle of the church toward him, and he had the particular experience that happens rarely in a life. The sense that everything you are is standing in the right place at the right time, and you know it. He said his vows with the same clarity with which he did everything that mattered to him, slowly, meaning each word, not performing it. She said hers with the same quality, no dramatics, just truth, which is the most dramatic thing there is. Afterward, there was a gathering in the church hall with food and music. Someone had a fiddle, someone else had a harmonica, and the dancing went until well past dark, which was not typical for a town with an early morning schedule but was entirely justified by the occasion. Ralph danced badly and knew it, and me found this extraordinarily endearing. She danced well, with the easy natural rhythm of someone who has music in their body from an early age, and she guided him through it with patience and quiet instruction in a way that seemed to him to be the perfect small metaphor for their entire acquaintance. Lucy danced with everyone who asked her, and then, at the end of the evening, fell asleep in her new dress on the church hall bench with her head on her father's knee, and Ralph sat with his hand on his daughter's hair and his wife's hand in his other hand, and looked around at the people of Caldwell in the warm light of the hall, and felt something that had been absent from him for 3 years, full, clean presence. Being entirely where he was, they moved Me's things from Mrs. Alderman's to the house at the livery the following week. Me brought her 4 books and her carpet-bag and a crate of school materials and a collection of pressed botanical sketches she had done since arriving in Caldwell. She had started a new book when she arrived, the old one left behind in Missouri, and the house received these additions the way a house receives the things it was waiting for. She made 2 changes to the main room. She added a second shelf to the wall near the fireplace for books, and she hung one of her botanical drawings next to Lucy's horse drawing in its wood frame. The result was that the room contained evidence of 3 different people, which was what it was. Ralph looked at the room and its new geometry and said, "It looks right." "It does," Me agreed. The school year ended in June, and Me spent the summer expanding the school's library. She wrote letters to book suppliers in Wichita and Kansas City and negotiated, with considerable skill, for donations and discounted prices, and by the end of summer had tripled the number of books available to the students of Caldwell. She also began teaching an evening class 2 nights a week for adults who wanted to improve their reading or arithmetic, which drew a small but consistent attendance, and which Caldwell came to regard as part of the unremarkable fabric of its life. Ralph's livery business expanded that year. With Me's management of the household accounts, she had a precise mathematical intelligence that revealed itself gradually and then comprehensively. They found ways to make the business more profitable, and Ralph hired a young man named Hector Seentz to help with the feed and the cleaning, which freed him for more time with the animals themselves, which was what he was best at. Hector was 19, the son of a Mexican family who had been in Kansas since before statehood, and he was quick and careful with animals and willing to learn everything Ralph knew. And Ralph taught him with the particular patience of someone who understands that showing a person how to do something well is a form of respect. Hector took to the work with a natural aptitude and became, within the year, somebody Caldwell regarded as part of the livery's identity. In October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Mae Kendrick had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule with a broken saddle strap, she told Ralph she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before the school day, with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely herself, and she watched his face with a stillness that was not anxious, exactly, but careful, because she knew enough about his history to understand that the news would carry multiple things at once. He was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. His face moved through things, not a simple happiness, but a complex one, the kind that contains the full history of a person. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a carefulness that was not restraint but reverence, and held her. "Okay," he said, into her hair. It was all he said, but it was full. "Okay," she said back. He cried briefly and quietly against the top of her head, and she held him and did not make it into anything other than what it was, which was a man feeling something real and being allowed to feel it. And she understood that this was not only joy but also the specific grief of remembering that joy costs something, that to love a child is to become permanently vulnerable in a way that cannot be undone, and that he was choosing it anyway. Lucy was told that evening. She sat with the information for a long moment, the way she sat with information she was processing. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" she asked. "We won't know until it arrives," Ralph said. "I want it to be a boy," Lucy said, "because I already know how girls work and a boy would be more interesting." Mae laughed, which was the right response, and Ralph's face did that thing it did now with increasing frequency, opened fully, into a smile that was nothing like the controlled, careful expression he had maintained for 3 years. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a settled one. The house was warm and full in the way that a house becomes warm and full when it is inhabited by people who are genuinely happy in the specific, unspectacular daily way. Not the dramatic happiness of extraordinary circumstances, but the deep, consistent warmth of ordinary life being lived well. Ralph and Mae had reached, by this point, the stage of intimacy that is not about discovery anymore, but about depth. The way you come to know a person not better but more truly as time passes. The way the surface knowledge becomes the beginning of an understanding that keeps going deeper. He knew by now that she cried at unexpected things, and not at the things most people cried at. She cried at good workmanship, a perfectly repaired piece of tack. The way Hector said good morning to the horses, never at hardship or disappointment, which she met dry-eyed and working. She knew that he got quiet when he was worried, and that when he was worried the way to reach him was not to ask directly but to be present and let him come out toward her at his own pace, and that he always did, given time. They argued still, about real things, and the arguments were good because they were honest, and because both of them were willing to change position when the other person had a better one, which is the rarest and most necessary quality in an argument. The baby came in the middle of a late April night in 1880, with Della Morris in attendance, because the doctor was out at a homestead 12 miles east and couldn't be reached in time. And Della turned out to be more than competent in the role, having assisted at 6 previous births in the community. The labor was long 14 hours, and Mae was exactly herself throughout it, which meant she was focused and working, and only occasionally allowed the pain to show in her expression. Ralph stayed. He had been advised by Della with cheerful firmness that he could stay if he was useful and had to leave if he was not, and he was useful. He brought things and fetched things and was present in the way she needed, and when she reached for his hand at the worst of it, he held her hand with both of his and did not look away. The baby was a boy. He arrived at 4 in the morning, announced himself with considerable volume, and was placed in Mae's arms with the specific wonder of a new person who is entirely himself and entirely new. Ralph looked at his son in Mae's arms in the lamplight of their bedroom with the spring dark outside, and felt something move through him that he did not have a name for. It was made of love and terror and gratitude, and the full, shattering, irreversible joy of a life that has expanded past what you thought was its capacity. "James," Mae said, which was the name they had agreed on. "James," Ralph said, in a voice that barely worked. Lucy, who had been kept in her room with strict instructions from Della and had obeyed them with great discipline until the baby arrived, came in when the commotion of arrival had settled and stood beside the bed looking at James with the focused attention she gave interesting things. "He's quite red," she said. "He'll improve," Mae said. "He's small," Lucy said. "He'll improve on that too," Ralph said. Lucy studied James for another moment and then looked at Mae with an expression that had in it something extremely open and true. "I'm glad you came here," she said. "On the mule." Mae reached out and took Lucy's hand. "Me too," she said. "Every single day, me too." James Ralph Rourke grew with the particular speed of children in good circumstances, healthy, loved, and surrounded by enough stimulation that his large dark eyes were always following something with interest. He had Ralph's gray-green eyes, oddly enough, in an otherwise dark-featured face, and he had Me's way of watching things carefully before he committed to a response. He adored his sister with an intensity that Lucy received with great dignity, occasionally allowing him to follow her on her expeditions around the livery and the surrounding terrain, and educating him on rocks and horses with the seriousness of a natural teacher. The school continued to thrive. By the fall of 1880, Mee had arranged for the building to be expanded. She had lobbied Deacon Ferris and the town council for funds with a combination of statistical argument and emotional appeal that proved irresistible, and the school gained an additional room for the older students, which allowed the class to be divided by age and the instruction to be more effective for both groups. She hired a young woman from Wichita, Helen Marsh, 22, just completed her teacher's training to manage the younger room, and the two of them worked together with a mutual respect that quickly became genuine friendship. Helen was delighted by Caldwell in the way that people from larger towns are delighted by the specific intimacy of small towns when they haven't been ruined by it yet, and she stayed. Ralph had a conversation with Deacon Ferris in the fall of 1880 about a piece of land to the east of the livery that had been idle since its previous owner had moved on 2 years prior. He had been thinking about this land for a while. It was good land, well watered, and he had ideas about expanding the livery's capacity into a proper horse breeding operation, which the trail season made economically viable and his own skills with horses made practically sound. He discussed it with me first, as he discussed all significant decisions, and she went over the numbers with him in the kitchen after Lucy and James were in bed, with a lantern and a piece of paper and the focused arithmetic intelligence that still occasionally startled him with its precision. "The numbers work," she said, "if the first season goes as you think it will." "If," he said. "There's always an if," she said, "but your horse knowledge is the best in 3 counties. Della told me that a breeder from Wichita came through last spring specifically asking for you. That's not nothing. It's a risk," he said. "Everything that matters is a risk," she said. "You know that better than most." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight. His wife, who was 30 years old and who had ridden into his life on a borrowed mule with a broken saddle strap and 40 cents, and dismantled everything he had built against the world, not through force or argument, but through the simple devastating power of being entirely, honestly, unconditionally herself. And he felt the particular fullness of a man who has been given more than he believed he deserved and has found over time. That the way to honor that is not guilt but gratitude expressed in living well. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said, without smugness, just as a statement of record. He purchased the land in October 1880. The breeding operation began the following spring with 3 mares, and a stallion whose temperament and lineage Ralph had spent most of the winter researching with the methodical thoroughness he applied to everything worth doing. Hector Seintz was given an equal partnership in the operation. Ralph had discussed this with me, and they were in agreement that Hector's contribution over 2 years warranted partnership rather than wages, and Hector received this news with a quiet, stunned gratitude that said something about what it meant to a young man of his background to be offered equal standing rather than perpetual service. The horse operation succeeded. Not immediately and not without setbacks. One of the 3 mares had a difficult foaling season, and a late spring ice storm damaged the new stable building and required expensive repair. But it succeeded in the solid, building way of things done correctly over time. By the fall of 1881 it was profitable, and by 1882 it was the primary operation and the livery the secondary, and Ralph Rourke's horses were known as far as Wichita. Mee's school had, by 1882, educated a significant portion of Caldwell's children to a standard that was noticeably higher than the surrounding region, which attracted the attention of the county education board in a way that was not entirely comfortable. They wanted to exert more oversight than Mae was prepared to accept, and she went to 2 separate meetings with county representatives and articulated, with the measured precision of a woman who has prepared carefully and is entirely certain of her ground, why the autonomy of the local schools served the students better than centralized oversight, and won both meetings, and the county board retreated with the bewildered respect of institutions that have encountered a competent person and are not quite sure what to do about it. Della Morris told this story at the sewing circle for the next 3 months. In the spring of 1882, Mae told Ralph she was expecting again. This time he was not quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. He picked her up, which surprised her considerably, and held her for a long moment without saying anything, and then set her down and looked at her with a smile that had in it everything. The full history of them, the 12 reasons dismantled, the year on the rise above the spring prairie, the kitchen table and the coffee, and the way she had held his hands the first time he really let her see him. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it out loud where you can hear it on purpose." She looked at him with those brown eyes that had never, in all the time he had known them, been anything other than direct and honest and entirely themselves. "I know," she said. "I've always known." "I want to say it anyway," he said. "Then say it again," she said. "I love you," he said. "Mae Rourke, I love you." She put her hand against his face, the way he had done to hers in the livery that March evening that had rearranged everything, and she looked at him with the full weight of a woman who has chosen and been chosen and knows the value of both. "I love you," she said. "Ralph Rourke. You and your 12 horses and your quiet and your daughter and our son and this whole honest life." She didn't know about the 12 reasons. She had never known they existed. She had simply been herself, and that had been enough. The second baby was born in November 1882, and was a girl, and was named Clara after Ralph's first wife, which had been Mae's suggestion, offered one quiet evening with the directness and generosity that was her character, and which had made Ralph hold very still for a moment, and then nod once, with the specific motion of a man receiving something he didn't know he was allowed to have the right to hold both loves without diminishment to either. Clara Rourke arrived in November with her mother's coloring and her father's eyes, and the considerable lung capacity of someone who intends to make her presence known, which she did, comprehensively, for the first 3 months. Lucy appointed herself Clara's senior advisor on all matters of Caldwell existence. James was 4 years old and regarded Clara with the mild philosophical tolerance of a child who has been displaced from the center of things and is working out the implications. The family settled into its shape, the house that had been one person's careful solitude, and then 2 people's new beginning, and then a family's full, warm, present life. Evenings by the fire with books and lamplight. Sunday mornings slow and domestic. The particular noise of a household with children, which is not always comfortable but is always vivid, always the full evidence of life being lived without reservation. Caldwell grew in those years. The cattle drives continued through the early 1880s, and the town grew with them and then grew past them, because a town with good schools and a good blacksmith and a stable horse business, and people who had put down roots becomes something different from a trail town. It becomes somewhere. Ralph Rourke became, without intending it, one of the people that Caldwell's character was built on. Not a leader in any formal sense, he declined, twice, an invitation to join the town council because he did not think he was suited to it. But the kind of person whose presence in a place makes the place feel more solid, more itself. The kind of man who does what he says he will do, who treats every person he encounters with the same basic level of respect, who teaches everything he knows to anyone willing to learn, who keeps his word as a matter of simple character rather than reputation management. Mae was the other. Her influence on the town ran through its children, through the evening classes, through the library she had built, and the standards she held and the way she spoke to people, directly, without condescension, as if everyone she met was capable of being spoken to honestly, and most of them proved her right. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, July 1884, Ralph and Mae rode out to the rise east of town, the one where he had asked her, in the spring of 1879, and she had said yes in the May light with the grass moving. They rode out after supper, leaving James and Clara in Della's enthusiastic care and Lucy, who was 12 by then and thoroughly responsible, supervising with the authority of a person who has been managing younger siblings for 4 years and has it well in hand. The rise in July was different from May. The grass was higher, and the heat still in the ground even as the sky cooled toward evening, and the stars beginning to show in the east with the particular clarity of a plain sky in summer. They sat on the rise with the view going to the edge of seeing, the way it always did, and they didn't talk for a while, which was easy between them in the way that easy silence is the measure of a real thing. 5 years, Ralph said. 5 years, Mae said. He looked out at the sky. When you rode in on that mule, he said, with the broken saddle strap. Henry, she said. His name was Henry. Henry, he said, with the small private amusement that came into his voice when she corrected him. When you came in and you asked about the boarding house, you were so calm about it, like you'd landed in exactly the right difficulty and you were going to deal with it. I was terrified, she said. He looked at her. You weren't. I absolutely was, she said. I had 40 cents and a borrowed mule and I had no idea whether this town would have anything for me. I was very frightened. She looked back at him with her straightforward brown eyes. I just don't find terror particularly useful to display. He thought about that. You never seem afraid, he said. I'm afraid of things that matter, she said. I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of something happening to the children. I'm afraid of wasting the years I have by not living them fully. She looked at the sky. But being afraid of something and letting it stop you are different things. You know that. He did know that. He had learned it by watching her, and by remembering his 12 reasons and the way they had one by one proven insufficient against the reality of her existence in his life, and by understanding, finally and completely, that the 12th reason, the fear of loving and losing, was not a reason to close himself to love, but rather the precise evidence of why love was worth having. I had reasons, he said, when you arrived. Reasons I wouldn't that I had decided not to marry again. She turned to look at him. 12 of them, he said. I counted, I said them every morning. She was quiet, looking at him with the full quality of her attention. You never knew, he said. You never knew they existed. You just were exactly who you are. And one by one they all stopped being true. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression he knew best, the one where she was attending to something completely, not managing it or performing a response to it, just receiving it. Tell me one, she said. The first one, he said, that I had loved someone with everything I had, and that was a thing a man could only do once. She held his eyes. And he said, I was wrong. She leaned against him on the rise above the Kansas summer prairie, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and held her the way you hold something you have been given twice, with the full knowledge of what having it means and what losing it would mean, and the choice made every day to hold it anyway. I'm glad Henry's saddle strap broke, she said. He laughed, full and real in the summer dark. So am I, he said. God, so am I. The stars came out over the prairie in their thousands, the way they do out on the plains where there is nothing between you and the sky, and Ralph Rourke and Mae Rourke sat on their rise above Caldwell, Kansas, and were entirely where they were, which is the whole of it. The whole of what a life is when it is lived well, when the walls come down at the right time. When a woman with 40 cents and a broken saddle strap and the most honest face you have ever seen rides into the right livery on the right morning and says your name like it is already familiar in her mouth, and you are wise enough eventually to understand what you have been given. The grass moved in the evening wind. The cattle were quiet in the fields. Somewhere back in town, Lucy would be reading to James and Clara by lamplight, making the words into the real things they are when read by someone who means them, the way her father had given her that quality and her stepmother had grown it, the way good things transmit through people who are present to each other. Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1884, was a town with a history and a future, and the specific grace of a place where people had chosen to stay and had made staying worthwhile. And in the middle of it, at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a former livery stable that was now a thriving horse operation, and a schoolhouse that had doubled its size, and a house where 4 people slept in the warmth of having been genuinely chosen. There was the ordinary evidence of a love that had been built from honesty and time, and the particular bravery of a man who had constructed 12 reasons not to feel it again, and a woman who had simply been herself. And in being herself had dismantled every last one. He never told her there had been 12. Or perhaps he did later on another evening on the rise, when the children were older and the stars were the same. Perhaps she laughed in her direct way and said she had suspected something of the sort. Perhaps he told her everyone in order, and she told him where each one had broken and when, and they turned them into a story together. The story of how walls come down not through force but through presence, not through persuasion but through the steady accumulation of a real person refusing, simply by existing, to be less than what they are. Ralph Rourke had 12 reasons. Mae Kendrick, who became Mae Rourke on a July afternoon in a completed church with wild flowers and interesting rocks, dismantled them all. She never knew they existed, and that was the whole of the miracle.